We next want to focus on another key industry group in Montana, and that is healthcare, and specifically on healthcare coverage in Montana. And to deal with this, I'd like to introduce the director of the Montana Kids Count program and our Bureau's Director of Community Research. Would you please welcome Daphne Hurley.
Thank you very much. I don't usually like following Norma because her topic is so interesting and her presentation style pretty dynamic, but I think if I'd followed Vince, you all would have run from the room. The British are coming, the British are coming. So, I'm quite happy to follow Norma this time. These presentations on healthcare over the past few years have not been exactly rosy, and the news on access to and affordability of health insurance in the US and in Montana continues to be less than encouraging, and certainly less encouraging than some of the presentations you've heard today. First of all, let's look at the situation at the national level. We spent $2 trillion on healthcare. Premiums rose 7.7%. And when we look closer at the premium increase, we see that the premiums just for family coverage have increased by 87% since 2000. Drug prices increased by 15%. And the number of uninsured Americans reached an all-time high. Almost 5.5 million more people lacked health insurance in 2005 than in 2001, which was a recession year, and primarily because of the erosion of employer-based insurance coverage. And this is evidenced in the last bullet, showing that the percentage of firms offering health insurance has fallen from 69% to 60% in the last 5 years. So how does Montana look? 19% of all Montanans are uninsured, and if you take out those covered by Medicare, that percent goes up to 22%. We spent $5 billion on healthcare and over $460 million on prescription drugs. The expenditure, the total healthcare expenditure, public health programs account for 28%. The Bureau has conducted 2 significant research reports on health insurance for the Department of Public Health and Human Services, one in 2003 and again in 2006. Thus, changes in offer rates, premium costs, etc., can be compared. The next few slides report some of those findings. The full report is available through our website. First of all, how did offer rates change? More firms are offering health insurance, with 49% of all Montanan firms offering it, which is up from 37% in 2003. As you probably know, offer rates very much depend on the size of the firm. Smaller firms are less likely to provide health insurance, whereas larger ones are more likely, and that's clearly as seen in the numbers. There is no great surprise that from the survey, the one reason for not offering health insurance was cost. That was given to us by 76% of the firms not offering it. Employers saw the cost of premiums increase between 2003 and 2006 by $70 for employee-only plans and $80 for employee and family plans. Both employers and employees paid much more for their health insurance, with a disproportionate shifting of higher health insurance premiums onto the employees. Thus, although employers saw an increase in premium costs, the amount that employees paid in 2005 increased even more. Employees paying just for their own health insurance, a single plan, saw a 77% increase in their monthly premiums between 03 and 06. And those covering their families as well as themselves saw a 29% increase. So it is positive that more firms are offering the benefit of health insurance. However, the downside to that is the cost shifting and what that means to working parents and other low-wage workers trying to afford health insurance. This has undoubtedly contributed to the increase in the number of children in Montana without health insurance. The rise in health insurance costs has been particularly hard on families living at or below poverty. Poverty, as defined by the federal government, is shown in your Outlook books on page 22. I have a small table that gives you the poverty levels, and the one that is most often used is that a family of 4 that has a household income of $20,000 or less is considered living in poverty. This slide shows that the percent of US versus Montana kids below poverty without health insurance. And you can see that between 2000 and 2005, the number of kids in Montana without health insurance has gone up from 19% to 29%. That is a very significant increase. And when you look at the national numbers in the same period, poor children in the nation without health insurance, the rates have actually dropped from 22% to 20%. We have 37,000 children in Montana without health insurance, and this slide shows how many of those 37,000 are below poverty versus the number that are above poverty without health insurance. Out of the 40,000 children in Montana in poverty, 12,000 are without health insurance, and of the approximately 165,000 Montana children above poverty level, 25,000 are without health insurance. The rate for all uninsured Montana children, not just poor children, is 16%, and that compares to a national rate of 11%. The significant thing about this slide is how many children above poverty do not have insurance. When we look closer at some of the different income brackets, we find that 7,000 children are without health insurance, and they live in families earning $50,000 or more a year. Now, there are an array of solutions that are generally used to ameliorate the problems of health insurance affordability and accessibility. These are just a few. It's unlikely that any one of these strategies will succeed in reducing uninsured rates for all of the population groups that experience higher uninsured rates. Instead, strategies will need to be tailored to particular groups of people, taking into consideration the very wide array of reasons people go without health insurance. In Montana, tax credit and premium assistance was an approach used through the establishment of the Insure Montana program during the 2005 legislative session. It provides tax credits and premium payments to eligible small firms for employee health insurance. The Act also provides for small business formation of purchasing pools designed to negotiate lower-priced health plans through group purchasing. The 2006 survey identified small firms participating in the program. Of the total number of firms surveyed, which was 486, there were 113 firms that were eligible for Insure Montana. Out of that 113 firms, 13 of them were either enrolled, in the process of enrolling, or waitlisted for the program. We asked several questions on insured Montana in our 2006 survey. Although a majority, 57%, had heard of the program, 43 had not heard of the program. 51% of those firms eligible for the program had not even heard of it. In this slide, we have the percentage of employees likely or not likely to participate in the program. 34% of these said they were likely to participate, whereas 24% said they were likely and 30% said they were unlikely. The highest percentage you see there was sort of ambivalent about participating but leaning towards doing so. Another strategy to address access to health insurance is to increase the number of children eligible for the Children's Health Insurance Program, or as is known as CHIP. This slide breaks down the amount of state money it would take to cover children below or above the poverty level. A strategy used in many different states is to increase the eligibility level for CHIP by including more children in higher income brackets. There are, I know, proposals on the table in Helena to do that, to raise the eligibility level for CHIP. The bottom line, though, is to expand CHIP to all children below poverty would cost the state $4.5 million. To expand it to all children above would cost $9.4 million. The cost of CHIP is cost shared by the federal government. For every $1 the state puts in, the feds put in $4. So investing that $13.9 million would bring in $55.6 million in federal dollars. There are many benefits to bringing more people into the ranks of the insured. These are just a few of the economic ones. Because of the cost of providing health care to people without health insurance in Montana, employer premiums is estimated to be 17% higher. The state of Illinois has estimated that it will save $70 million if it insures all children. The savings come from more health care, regular health care visits, taking care of high-cost health conditions when the child is young. And the reduction in emergency room visits, of course. There are also the very real economic benefits of state dollars bringing in federal dollars, and that $55.9 million we talked in CHIP money coming in would have a job and income impact adding up to about $60 million. So in conclusion, there are a couple of major points to make. According to the employer survey, Montana employers expect to do more cost shifting to workers. This will result in an increased number of workers not utilizing health insurance benefits offered by the job. And increasingly, they will make the economic choice not to take it either for themselves or their families. And in parting, other states are moving ahead with state-level health reform, and they are all focusing on cost containment and savings from covering more uninsured people. Thank you very much, and questions?
Comments? Healthcare questions?
There's one.
Is there any support in Montana for looking at mandatory participation, like Massachusetts and California?
Oh, right. Some of the other states in their health reform have made health insurance mandatory, just like car insurance is nationwide, and I don't believe there is any such thing being discussed in Montana, although there are a lot of ideas being tossed around, and I know Montana is beginning to think about having to address this.
Other questions, comments? Oh, yes.
Hi, Barbara.
The families over $50,000 a year are choosing to pay their health care costs themselves.
Right. The question was, do we think that the people who, the children who are living in families with 50,000 or more, are they choosing not to get private insurance? Is that?
have insurance, just to pay their health care.
And that may well be so, that they are choosing, rather than to pay health insurance, they're paying for their health care on a as-needed basis. And that I'm very sure there's a sort of rule of thumb on the national level that you have to be about 300% above poverty, which for a family of four would be 60,000, to make that rational economic choice.
Time for one more question or comment. Yes?
Is the Montana legislature considering 4.5 million appropriation for CHIP?
The question was, is the Montana legislature considering the 4.5 million to bring in all children under poverty onto the CHIP program? What is being considered at the moment in Helena are two proposals. At current level, CHIP eligibility is set at 150% of the poverty level. There are two proposals on the table in Helena, one for 160% of poverty and another one for 175% of poverty.
Good. Thank you, Daphne.
Thank you.
Again, Daphne will be with us for the rest of today, and you know where to find Daphne if need be. And in our next segment, I would like to take a few moments to talk about manufacturing in Montana, including the forest products industry. And I would like to, first of all, recognize two of the people that worked with me in putting together this presentation, and that would be Tala Dillon from our bureau. Tala. And Laura Toomey from Montana Business Connections. I haven't seen Lori. Is she here yet? I'll introduce her at lunch if she's not. Thank you, Lori, as well. Well, that's how that works. I've been watching them do it all day. Montana's not a heavily industrialized state, of course, and when people think of Montana, they don't think of manufacturing, but in fact, as these statistics indicate, manufacturing is a substantial grouping of industry sectors within Montana. As you can see, there are some 27,400 people that work in manufacturing in Montana. They earned last year about $1.2 billion in labor income. And manufacturers in the state of Montana produced products as they left the plant gate in Montana that were worth some $8 billion. And Paul talked to you about its place in the economic base. It accounts for some 20 to 25% of Montana's economic base. So as you see, it's a substantial economic grouping of sectors in Montana's economy. Manufacturing represents, as you'll get a flavor for, a broad array of activities. To clarify it a bit, let me first just define what I'm talking about when I talk about manufacturing. We're defining it as adding value to the mechanical or chemical transformation of substances or materials into new products. There's maybe a simpler way to say that in Montana. If it's not, if you're doing that and it's not mining and it's not construction, then it's likely in our list of manufacturers. We look at Montana, we have an array of manufacturers from very heavy manufacturing like metals and petroleum refineries, the pulp and paper mill here in Missoula County, wood and paper products industry, through a high-tech sector and a whole list of light manufacturers. I've outlined in the Outlook booklet on pages 24 through 28 some information on manufacturing forest products. That'll give you some flavor for what's in manufacturing a little more specifically. And please contact me if you want to get into some real detail on manufacturing. But what I really want to do today are talk about some trends in manufacturing, and then what's the outlook for manufacturing. So let's look at a little bit of history related to manufacturing in Montana. This is a graph of employment including the self-employed in Montana's manufacturing industries from 1990 through 2006. And you can tell by looking at that the 1990s, measured by employment and other measures, was a good period for manufacturing. Employment increased by more than 10% during the 1990s. Sales were up and production was up and so on. And the reasons for that have been mentioned. It was a period of very good U.S. and global economic conditions, and we saw the startup of some major manufacturing facilities in Montana, expansion of others, and the startup of a lot of smaller manufacturing operations in Montana. And during that period, really the only decline among major sectors in Montana was in the wood and paper or forest products industry, and that was directly related to the substantial decline in federal timber harvest that took place during the 1990s. Well, then in contrast, as we look at the period from 2000 through 2003, there was a sharp fall off in manufacturing activity in Montana. Employment declined during those 3 years by about the same level that it increased during the 10 years of the 1990s. It declined by about 10%. And the decline involved plants in virtually all of the major categories in the state. Numerous causes of those declines. Again, weaker U.S. economic and global conditions, recession in 2001, 9/11 and the aftermath of that, a very strong U.S. dollar, and then the electricity spike in 2000 and 2001 and the aftermath of that, which impacted a number of very large manufacturers in the state. So we had good performance in the 90s and then very poor performance in the period 2000 to 2003. Well, since 2003, again, as you can see there, operating conditions improved, and there were substantial increases in manufacturing activity. We saw a much stronger U.S. economy, much stronger global economy, as Paul and Rick and others pointed out. We also saw a much weaker U.S. dollar, and all of those things helped manufacturers in Montana to one extent or another. And during the 2004, 2005, 2006 period, we saw about a 10% increase in employment. We saw labor income or workers' earnings increase by about $130 million when adjusted for inflation. And we saw the value of products produced by Montana manufacturers increase by some $2 billion. Now, Paul talked about the very high commodity prices, in particular in 2006, which took place despite some slowing in the U.S. economy. The global economy was so strong that it led to a spike in a lot of commodity and high-tech prices, and that certainly helped Montana manufacturers. I want to mention, though, that also impacting positively a lot of Montana manufacturers has been the strong growth of the economy itself in Montana and adjacent states, as we saw manufacturers sell to other economic sectors like construction, like agriculture, mining, and to other manufacturers, and as well as to individual consumers in the region. So the strength of the regional economy also was a boost for manufacturers. Where did the growth take place? If we look by major sector within manufacturing, the largest growth in worker earnings, the measure that Paul talked most about, was in a category that we've labeled chemicals, petroleum, and coal products. Labor income in that category was up almost 30% in that 3-year period, up some $50 million. And most of that increase, but although not all of it, was at petroleum refineries. The second area of major growth was in the category of machinery, computer equipment, and electronic parts, and that would include Montana's high-tech sectors, as well as some things such as electronics and precision instruments and tools, and that segment grew almost 20%. Those were the two major sectors contributing to the growth. Again, the only decline among the major sectors in that 3-year period was in the wood and paper products industry, and that was down about 1%. Let me take a look at that sector. It is the largest sector of manufacturing in Montana, and again, it is the only one to decline during that period. If you've been at our seminars, in particular in the last couple of years, you've heard me emphasize timber availability. In 2004 and 2005, we saw very high prices for wood products, and yet we still saw declines in the wood and paper products industry, and that was related to timber availability. What I've graphed here is lumber prices for the period 1990 through 2006. Lumber is the major output of Montana's wood products industry, and now if I look at 2006 and had to rate the issues that were of most significance to the industry operating in 2006, it would be price rather than timber availability. You can see the very sharp fall off in lumber prices, ignoring that side of the room, that took place in 2006. Unlike a lot of the other commodities that Paul talked about earlier in his presentation that spiked dramatically in 2006, there was a sharp fall off in softwood lumber prices. And to capsulize the cause of that, it was the dramatically lower U.S. housing starts that took place in 2006, less demand for lumber, lower prices for lumber. That doesn't mean that the timber availability issue has gone away. This is a graph of timber harvest in Montana for the same time period, going back to 1990. The major change through that period, the blue line, decline in national forest timber harvest, which has their program continues at very low levels. And to illustrate the magnitude of the ongoing problems and difficulties the national forests have in selling timber and bringing projects that involve selling timber to the marketplace. Last year, U.S. Forest Service Region 1, which encompasses northern Idaho and Montana, had more than twice as much timber volume under litigation and appeal as they were able to sell during the year. I should point out that inventory is also inventory appears to be a limiting factor as we look at private lands in the state. The magenta line here, and you can see declines that occurred even in 2004 and 2005, which again indicates to me what some of the private landowners have been saying, that they simply do not have now the standing inventory to sustain the level of harvest that took place during the early part of the 1990s. Mentioning at least one other major component of the forest products industry, and that is the linerboard or pulp and paper industry, linerboard plant here east of town. Linerboard prices have been pretty good in 2006, but Fiber availability also is a problem that has impacted that sector. So if we look at the forest products industry and changes from 05 to 06, they were actually not as negative as I expected they would be. We see a decline of about 250 workers out of close to 10,000, sales value down by $100 million approximately, and lumber production off by about 6%. Quick look at Missoula County and manufacturing in Missoula County. Missoula County is the third largest manufacturing center in the state of Montana, behind Yellowstone and Flathead County. We have just over 3,900 people working in manufacturing in Missoula County, and they earned some $213 million in labor income last year. And again, Paul's estimate is that manufacturing accounts for 15 to 20% of Missoula County's economic base. About 70% of the manufacturing in Missoula County is in the wood, paper, and furniture products industries, and that's been down slightly over the last 3 years. Other sectors, which include things like food, beverages, and metal fabrication, precision instruments, and some chemical manufacturing, they, taken as a whole, have been up slightly, and for the last 3 or 4 years, manufacturing in Missoula County has been level or flat. We have some folks from Ravalli County here, so very quickly we look at Ravalli County's industry. It also is heavily dependent on, or heavily composed of wood products firms. About 2/3 of the manufacturing activity in Ravalli County is directly in the wood products industry, most of that in the log home industry, which for the last 3 years or so has been relatively stable, but declined began to reach its peak really in 1999, and then with some of the impacts in 2000 and 2001 has not fully recovered to its highest, to the high levels that existed in the late 1990s. We do a survey each year in preparation for these Outlook seminars of manufacturers in Montana, and partly to gauge their outlook and partly to look at major issues to manufacturers. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about issues. We'll produce a publication that will have a great deal of detail on the feedback from our manufacturer survey. I just simply want to point to one table, table 3 on page 26, and I think it's almost self-explanatory, and I just ask you to look at the difference between 2005 and 2006, and the fact that even with $3 gasoline and $3 diesel fuel, as we look at 2006, issues that were rated very important were labor and healthcare related issues, all of which ranked above the energy issues, pointing to an array of things like the tight labor market, like the needs and concerns of manufacturing as well as other employers for quality workers, and of course, as Daphne talked about, the cost of health care. So let's get to our outlook for manufacturing. Given that we've had three good years for manufacturing in Montana, these numbers look good to me. The manufacturers that responded to our survey, about 45% of them actually expect 2007 to be better than 2006, and only 12% expect that it will be worse. And given that outlook and feedback from the manufacturers, and looking at some major economic factors that might influence manufacturers in Montana, some negatively and some positively, our projection for manufacturing is for the 4th year of growth, perhaps modest growth in manufacturing in the state of Montana, with the largest downside risk again in the forest products industry, both due to the very weak housing market, which which most analysts don't expect to recover to any significant degree until well into 2007, and also the ongoing issues related to timber availability. And with that, I'll stop and be glad to answer questions or take comments. Questions, comments? Yes? Is the question, to what degree have the Canadians influenced the softwood lumber market? The Canadians have influenced the softwood market. They are very, very strong influence on the softwood lumber market. The United States is a major market for Canadians lumber exporters. Even during this downturn, many of you have read about the bug infestations in British Columbia, which are ranging in the tens of millions of acres. Canadians are very actively trying to deal with that, in part by harvesting timber and making it available to their mills, so they're continuing to produce at relatively high levels through this downturn in the market. Canadian imports to the U.S. are down this year, or last year, with the weaker market, but they continue as a major factor. There is a new Canadian softwood lumber agreement, which I believe will at least tend to set a floor for softwood lumber prices, because it requires a duty from Canadians when prices fall below a certain level. And I also believe that it will probably reduce some of the volatility that has existed in the softwood lumber market over the last 10 to 15 years, although not entirely. Is that? I can answer, yes.
Chuck, do you have any information or data on what's happening with exports from Montana?
The question is, do I have any information about what is happening with exports from Montana, exports out of the country? I don't have a number, Steve. As you know, exports out of the U.S. in 2006 were up, and I know that's true in wood products and other segments of manufacturing, and of course the weaker dollar helps exports, and so that is why we mention the weaker dollar as one potential positive for manufacturers. I think with that I better stop, and I'll be around obviously, and be glad to visit with others as we either today or you can reach me at the Bureau. Thank you. We reserve the premium spot on our program for the Missoula Area Chamber of Commerce. And the first thing I'd like to do is thank the Chamber for their help and support in putting together these Outlook seminars each year. And I'll introduce some Chamber folks at lunch. But we've asked the Chamber of Commerce to provide a speaker to round out our look at the Missoula area and the Montana economy. And this year we have with us the Chamber's chair of the Montana Council on Industry and the Economy. And he's also the technical services manager at the Smurfit Stone plant in Frenchtown, to talk about some activities that the council has been involved in and some other things going on in Missoula. Would you please welcome Neil Markser.
Thank you, Chuck. President Julie Gaymar Williams, who is the current president of the Chamber, asked me to speak today to update you on what the Chamber is doing to support business in the Missoula area. The Missoula Chamber of Commerce currently has over 950 members, and we represent about 19,000 employees in the Missoula area. I'd like to update you on two areas that the Chamber is actively pursuing to help businesses in Missoula. During the 2006 Chamber retreat, one of the main issues that came up was workforce task force and what the Chamber can do to better prepare people to enter the workplace. Out of that Chamber seminar came a direction to the MCIE committee, or the Montana Council of Industry and Economy, that we pursue that issue. From that, we have developed a workforce task force that is currently chaired by Matt Jones, who is on Senator Baucus's staff. And what the task force has done is they have first met with community representatives, education, small businesses, medium-sized businesses, large businesses, and they developed questionnaires for a survey. That survey was then sent out to the Chamber members and also members of the Montana Area Economic Development Community. From that survey, we've had currently 150 responses back, and what we are currently doing is summarizing these responses so then we can develop some potential programs to help better prepare people for the workforce. Our hope is that we can coordinate with the local high school, with the University of Montana, and the College of Technology to better develop a program that employees, potential employees, and employers can participate in to bring people better prepared to enter the workforce in Missoula. The second thing the Chamber does is what we call Keep Missoula Working. Keep Missoula Working really is a five-pronged approach that the MCIE committee that I chair up does for the Missoula businesses. The first thing we do is we go out and interview a business. Last month we interviewed Allegiance Medical Services. From that interview we obtain significant facts for the businesses, such as number of employees, donations, etc. From that we take that information and we work with our partner, which is KPAX TV, and a big round of applause for KPAX if they're here today, because they put on a free ad for that business throughout the month. The third thing we are currently doing is radio spots, and a thank you to Clear Channel radio stations, because they put on airtime supporting new business members that join the Chamber every month. Our fourth approach is a website. The Chamber's website is currently up and active, and we keep all the presentations we have prepared on the Chamber website. Our fifth approach is the Chamber newsletter insert. Every other month there's a 4-page insert that's put on by the Montana Council of Industry and Economy, and what we focus on in that insert is business issues that affect Chamber members and businesses in the Missoula area. And we also showcase businesses to explain to the community of what businesses are in the Missoula area and how much they support the community, with the hopes that we put our face forward in the community so that the businesses that are part of the Chamber really are supported by the community. In conclusion, I guess the message that I'd like to leave you is that the Chamber thinks Missoula is a great place. We want to make Missoula a better place for all of us, and we thank you for your help.
Neil would be glad to answer questions if there are. Yes?
Could you comment on the Chamber's position on federal resort and the perceived or actual
the question is, would Neil comment on the Chamber's position on the Bitterroot Resort, and if there is the perception that there is some reticence to take a position?
The Chamber hasn't taken a position on the Bitterroot Resort yet. There is a Bitterroot task force that is chaired by Mark Springer, and that task force is going to do some sort of an economic study on what the Bitterroot Resort would do for the Missoula area, and after that, the Chamber may then elect to take a position on that, but it's not planned for now.
Other questions for Neil? If not, thank you, Neil. Well, we want to close out our session today with a continuing look at Asia, and to do that, we have with us a senior fellow at the Center of the Rocky Mountain West at the University of Montana. He's certainly well known to all of you for, among other things, his 26 years of service in the Montana House and Senate, and his 4 years of service as Montana's Secretary of State. He, I might add, also has degrees from the University of Montana and Montana State University, so he can pass in both Bobcat and Grizzly circles. He has recently returned from a faculty exchange at Nanking University in Tianjin, China, where Mike Mansfield served as a Marine some 84 years ago. So to give us some additional perspectives from China, would you please welcome Bob Brown?
Well, thank you all. I suppose if I talk for a long time now, everybody needs to go to the bathroom and get back to their jobs and that sort of thing, so I won't take advantage of the situation, but I do appreciate the opportunity, and I want to thank the First Interstate Banks for being the wonderful sponsors of these seminars as we travel around the state. As was mentioned, I was in China in the spring as a part of a faculty exchange project, and when I learned from Terry Widener, the director of the Mansfield Center, that I had this opportunity, I guess pretended like I probably knew where Tianjin, China was, and I knew about Nanking University, but I went back to my office and I Googled Tianjin, and I found out that it was a city, or is a city, of 10 million people. It's twice the size of Chicago. And I could honestly say I had not heard of it. Actually, I had read the biography of Mike Mansfield, written by Don Oberdorfer, and not long before I went over there. And there's mention in the book of Senator Mansfield's assignment in China as a Marine back in the 1920s. But the city was identified as Tianjin. Well, that's how you say Tianjin now. Just like we used to say Peking, and now we say Beijing. These are things that the modern people in China have done to change the way we pronounce the names of the major places in China to coincide with the spelling. So anyway, I hadn't known that, and I'm not sure I would have remembered it if it had been Tianjin, even so. But I think what that does is it helps to underscore the size of China and how little we know about it, how mysterious it is to us. You know, it was a mysterious place in the world for a long time back centuries ago, and it remains so even now. The Chinese tend to keep pretty closely to themselves. Whether this is entirely true or not, I'm not sure, but they're fond of pointing out that they've never invaded any other country, that they've always kept to themselves militarily, and that they've never attempted to establish any kind of a imperialistic or colonial empire. And so that's part of why I think they've been kept apart to a great extent from the Western world, and we haven't known them very well or much about them. Remember, in his wonderful presentation this morning, Phil West mentioned that there are 250 cities in China with populations in excess of 1 million. Just almost unfathomable. So it is a huge place, both geographically and in terms of its population. When I landed in Beijing, which is about a 2-hour drive from Tianjin, the aircraft approached the great airport in Beijing, and all I could see beneath the plane was this vast carpet of mustard-colored smog. China has almost indescribable air pollution problems. Sometimes things clear up, but for the most part, when I was there was this omnipresent smog, this shroud of smog that you could see in almost every direction, any place you were. And the reason for the peculiar color to it, at least up in the Beijing area, is because there are dust storms that blow off the Gobi Desert over toward eastern China frequently. And the dust from the desert combines with the industrial smog, the industrial smoke, primarily coal pollution, and it creates this very foul air. It's a serious problem. The Chinese are attempting to address it because the Olympic Games will be there in 2008, and they want to clear up the air at least a little bit prior to the time that many people will visit there then. You can't drink the water in China. You can't in many third world countries, but you certainly can't there. So you have to buy it bottled, or if you ask for water, and they give it to you, other than in a bottle, it's always hot. And that's so you'll understand it's been boiled, and therefore it's okay to drink. They've got a kind of a peculiar custom too. They believe that when you're warm, if you, as I did, if you've hiked way up the Great Wall of China, or if you've gone someplace hiking through the Tiananmen Square or wherever, and you're thirsty, I'm ready for a cold drink of water or a Coca-Cola or a cold beer or something. Well, in the case of this young fellow who traveled with me, the graduate student who was with me most of the time when I was in China, when I had opportunities to leave the campus and travel, his favorite drink was hot bean juice. Honestly. They think warm things are best when you're warm, that you should drink something warm when you're hot. And of course that's pretty contrary to anything we understand, and especially warm bean juice. I wouldn't recommend it. Shortly after I arrived, I was teaching in one of my classes, and this young fellow came up to me and in almost perfect English, he said, "Bob Brown, you're from Montana? So am I." And I took a double take because he was clearly Chinese. And he said, "I'm Wong Li." And he said, I earned my master's degree at the University of Montana from 1996 to 1998. So we developed a good and warm friendship. He by then had become a faculty member back in his hometown of Tianjin there at Nankai University. And I asked him, I said, "You've lived here all your life and you're familiar with the Mansfield Center?" "Oh, absolutely." And I said, "Well, you know that Senator Mansfield was stationed here. Is there a building or a facility, or do we know anything about that?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, the building is still standing. The building in which those Marines were barracked when Mansfield was here is still there. I can take you to it. So I'll show you a picture of it here in a minute when we get into the slide part of my presentation. I can tell you that while I was there, I taught 2 classes. One in the evening that was primarily graduate students. In most cases, their English was very, they just barely spoke English. They'd had some exposure to it in the school system, but not very much. And many of those people were career government bureaucrats who were studying for a master's degree in public administration. And they were, I would say, most of them in their 30s and 40s. But the undergraduates that I taught, most of whom were in their late teens and early 20s, were so fluent in English that we didn't even need to use an interpreter. Well, what conclusion do we draw from that? We draw the obvious conclusion that they're placing a heavy emphasis on English instruction in their public school system. And they'll tell you why. Because English is the commercial language of the world. And they are intent on rising up and becoming an economic power in the world. They believe in themselves, they believe that they can do this, and they are intent on making it happen. And you see evidence of English all over the place. Even on the street signs in the big cities, in the major cities. You'll see the Chinese characters that spell out the name of the street or the avenue, and you'll see beneath them those same characters in English. So they're trying basically to become a bilingual country with English as the prominent second language. And there are scarcely any Americans, of course, that speak Chinese. I don't know how important it is, but I think it is probably important in terms of understanding them and how they see themselves and what they hope to accomplish. You see a forest of construction projects in China. That's part of the economic boom that's taking place there. Their economy is growing at a rate of 10% a year, but their job growth rate is a fraction of that. So even the well-educated people, the young people who are so optimistic and have such a positive spirit about the future, still have some anxiety about whether there'll be a place for them and whether they'll be able to find a job. So one of the things the government's doing is it's involved heavily in public projects, public works projects. And approximately 50% of the cement in the entire world is being used in China today. 50% of all the cement in the world is being used in China today, and I think probably half of what's being used in China is being used in Shanghai. It's a huge amount. And 25% of the world's copper, which of course has had a good impact on the city of Butte here in Montana. Copper was $1 a pound, I think, 3 years ago or so, and now it's in the vicinity of $3 a pound. And a lot of that's due to the demand in China. And we hear people talk about how the use of petroleum in China is distorting the price of oil worldwide and increasing energy prices. But then we ask ourselves, well, how can that be the case when there are only 20 million automobiles in China and there are 200 million in our country? How can that be? Well, the major reason for that is that the petroleum that's used in the asphalt to build the highway network in China, that's a part of their big public works project, is where a major portion of the demand for petroleum in China is coming from. And then you say, well, why would they need to build all those roads if they don't have very many automobiles? Well, because I guess the Chinese equivalent of the American dream is owning an automobile. Professor Han, who was the exchange professor with me and who's now teaching here at the university, told me that when he was a young boy, he said they hoped for appliances in their household. They hoped that maybe they'd have a washing machine or an electric range, or probably the most unimaginable extravagance would be a television set. Now most Chinese have those things. And even the kids have cell phones. It's just a nation of cell phones. But the per capita income in China is about that of the per capita income of Panama. Somewhere in the ballpark of $1,500 American dollars a year. So they're very poor. There are really two Chinas. China has a population of 1.3 billion people, and about 800 million of them live in the rural parts of China, although we have to understand rural could mean cities of 1 million people or more. And so those are among the poorest people in the world. But the people who live in the big cities in some cases are among some of the richest people in the world today. And that's a fact about China that could lead to instability, and it gives a lot of anxiety to the government in China. They're concerned about the people in the countryside coming to the big cities, not being able to find jobs, becoming impatient. Perhaps there could be some unstable kind of situations result from that. So one of the things they do is they keep the people employed in public works projects to the greatest extent they can, and they hold out the hope that the people in China might someday be able to own an automobile. And they're in the process now with heavy government subsidy to build these little automobiles called Cherries, C-H-E-R-Y. They're very fuel efficient, very small, extreme compact cars, and they can make them, or they can sell them for something less than $3,000, or something less than $4,000, about $3,500 American, which is still nearly triple, at least 2.5 times the per capita income in China, but it's at least remotely in reach of an upwardly mobile Chinese person. And so they're building the roads with the anticipation that there'll be more and more Chinese people who will be able to buy automobiles. Phil West pointed out in his presentation this morning that if they follow the model that's been the blueprint toward prosperity, as people understand it, as individuals understand it, the way we measure prosperity in the Western world, that they'll, and if they continue to own automobiles at the rate that they're increasing ownership of them in China, I think his statistic was by something like 2025, there would be 400 million automobiles in China. And of course, that could have profound consequences on their environment unless they're very clean automobiles. He doubts that will happen, and I do too, but there'll be a great deal more automobiles in China, there's no question about it, as more and more Chinese enter into the middle class. And inevitably that will happen. You find that Mao Zedong is a saint in China. He was, remember, the revolutionary leader that won the Chinese Civil War. And then he became the governmental leader of China afterwards and proved to be a disastrous one. One of his policies was that each Chinese mother be rewarded as a hero mother if she had at least 5 children. And obviously their country had a problem sustaining itself because of its population even in the 50s and 60s. And so this became a crisis situation in the middle 1970s during the latter period of the Cultural Revolution, which was a diversion on his part to take the people's minds away from their suffering. Basically, his approach was the only thing wrong with communism is it isn't pure enough. We need to have more pure communism. Well, of course, it was leading to massive starvation. And shortly after his death, he was replaced by Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping was a pragmatist. And he just realized that they had to be able to feed themselves. And so he was willing to abandon some of the fundamental principles of communism to make that happen. And one of the first things that was thrown overboard was this concept of the collective farm. So they interjected private enterprise into agriculture, and the result was that they were, in short order, able to feed themselves, and now can feed themselves very well. But they have enormous problems, one of which is related to their population. I think you know that in China they now have the one-child policy. Remember the graphs that Phil West showed this morning of the pyramid and how the pyramid's becoming a nail cake, or it's becoming almost straight up and down? Well, we've got a somewhat similar problem in our country in the respect that we're not having as many children or as large families as we used to have, and we're living longer. So our concern is how Social Security is going to pencil out 20 or 30 or 50 years from now. Well, just imagine their situation, where they've got this enormous bulge in their population of all these 5 and larger children families. They're now in their 20s and 30s and 40s and so on. And then behind them, they've got these tiny families with just one child per family. Just if you understand the demographic enormity of that problem, along with the environmental problems that they've got, and it's easy to see how there are great challenges facing the modern Chinese. But you see this spirit of optimism. You see this spirit that they're sure that their lives are better than they were, and they're sure that in the future their lives will be better than they are now. We wonder sometimes why they don't buy more things from us. It seems as though we just buy things from them, and the balance of trade is so heavily in their favor. Well, part of the reason is that they're poor. Many of the millions of people in China don't have very much money, but there are some of them that have quite a bit of money too. But for the most part, the savings rate in China, depending on the statistics you read, is somewhere between 30% and 45%. Let me say that again. Savings rate somewhere between 30% and 45%. Do you know what it is in the United States? Yeah, I think it's 0. I think we don't save any money in the United States because we know we're going to be taken care of when we're old. We assume that there'll be Social Security there for us, or that are, somehow or other we'll sell the house, and I guess I don't know what our thinking is always, but we've got this abiding faith that we'll be taken care of when we're elderly. The Chinese know they won't be, because there's only one child. And when the child gets married, that child's going to have to take care of his parents or her parents. And if they have to move to a different village or something like that, that could really complicate that problem. And there's almost no social safety net. And once was a communistic workers' paradise. So they feel, probably accurately, that they have to save everything that they can in order to take care of themselves in their own old age. And that's part of why they don't spend the money, they don't spend their savings on products that are manufactured in the United States. A couple more things. There's some distrust of the United States, especially among the older people. The young people tend to be very open to the United States. They're interested in our styles, they're interested in our language, they're interested in what they assume is the consumerism that they hope to be a part of. There's some fear and concern about Japan. They suffered during World War II more than most countries in the war, primarily because of when they were in their conflict with the Japanese, and they resent the fact that we didn't recognize them, didn't recognize the Chinese because of the communist takeover after World War II, but we did everything we could to build up the Japanese, and they regard the Japanese as at least a distant threat. And there's fear and foreboding about the Japanese and some resentment that, well, they fought on our side against the Japanese during World War II. We didn't do anything to help them after World War II, but instead helped the Japanese who had been so brutal in China during the war. They have a renewed closeness to Russia, primarily because they're heavily dependent on Russia for sources of energy. China has no navy, or virtually no navy. So they don't want to be placed in a position of having to bring energy products from the Middle East or South America. They develop their own coal on a massive scale, some nuclear energy, but it's mostly coal, and then they bring oil and natural gas in from Russia, so it's important that they maintain a good relationship with Russia. They've abandoned communism, but they're not sure for what. And I think it would be a mistake to assume that having abandoned communism, that they've embraced democracy, because they're the furthest thing from a free democracy. For one thing, I was not able to get CNN World Report anywhere I was in China. And I've been in different places in the world, and I've picked up CNN in Kyrgyzstan, in Borneo, in Angola, in Murmansk up north of the Arctic Circle, but I couldn't get it in Beijing or Xi'an or Tianjin or any place I was in China. And what I could get was the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, but there would be long pauses, blackouts, that sort of thing. To begin with, I thought there was something wrong with my television set, and I asked another one of the foreign professors, and he said, no, it's not your television set, it's government censorship. So there is that. A pretty chilling statistic is that Amnesty International estimated that last year, I guess now it'll be 2 years ago, in 2005, the government there legally, officially executed something in excess of 10,000 people. So it can be a pretty brutal regime if you're out of step with the government. And of course, it doesn't even, there are no elections. It's just a clique of about 9 members that are the Central Committee of the Communist Party that rule the country. I'm going to show you some pictures here in conclusion, then give you an opportunity to ask some questions, but I want to close with a quick story. You know, I mentioned that there's this emphasis on English in the school system. And that's definitely the case in the city schools, less so in the country schools. And there's a real dichotomy in their society between people who live in the country and live in the city. So they teach English as best they can in the country schools, but they don't do a very good job of it. And they have a rather rigid system of testing. And if the students do well on the tests, they're given an opportunity to matriculate higher in the educational system. If they don't move. And the opportunities are far less in the rural communities and in the urban communities. I'd only been there for a week or 10 days, and I was grumping to Professor Hahn, the faculty member who exchanged with me and who is here now, that it would be nice to have a Western meal, an American meal. I enjoyed noodles and dumplings and rice and that kind of stuff, but I'd like another kind of a meal. So he took me to this Western restaurant, which was really more European than American. And when we got there, the young servers lined up with the maitre d'. She was a woman, probably of middle age, and they were just young teenage girls from out in the Chinese countryside, probably in their early teens. And so they didn't know much English, but she greeted us by, she said, hello, and then they would say, hello, good evening, hello. And so we were escorted to a table, and then she came over to take our order, and she had probably looked like the newest and youngest of these kids with her. And so through Professor Hahn, I negotiated for what I wanted for my supper. I said I wanted a T-bone steak and a baked potato, and I wanted some whiskey and water. Well, remember, it's tough to get cold water there, so we had to figure out how we were going to get she wanted to sell me a whole bottle of whiskey, and she had some there. But I didn't. I said, it's not like wine, you know. Well, I don't want a whole bottle of it. So anyway, we finally got to the bottom of that. When we got done, I said, okay. I said, it's a deal. And she left. And then we had a very nice dinner. And then as we were leaving, this couple, looked like a farm couple, came in. This looked like a big old farm guy and his wife. And they were standing there, and they lined up in front of him just as Professor Hahn and I were walking out. And she said, good evening. And the kid said, hello, hello, good evening. And the little one on the left far end flashed in this big $1 million smile and said, it's a deal. That's the term in English that she'd learned. Well, let's show you the pictures here. I don't want to take too much of our time. That's the administration building at Nankai University, and you can't tell obviously, but the statue in front of the building is that of Zhou Enlai. Zhou Enlai was the premier or the prime minister of China when Mao Zedong was the chairman of the Communist Party. Chairman Mao, and then this guy was the number 2 guy. Well, he had known Mansfield clear back in the 40s. This Zhou Enlai had. And I found it such an interesting coincidence that we've got a statue of Mansfield here at the University of Montana and his wife Maureen, and that they've got a statue of their outstanding alumni. He graduated from Nankai University outside of their administration building, and that they were critically important in putting together the visit of Nixon to China. It actually started with the liaison between Mike Mansfield and Zhou Enlai, and it ended up with the normalization of relations between our two countries. Do you know what the name of the chairman of the Communist Party in China is now? Hu, H-U. And do you know what his successor's name is, the premier's name is? Wen. And that's an interesting coincidence too, because we're not sure, they're not sure either. There's so much mystery about their government, where they're going, what their future is, and that sort of thing, and their leaders happen to be who and when. That's my graduate class, the one I taught in the evenings. Those people, as I say, were mostly in their 30s and 40s, and I had to do that entirely through an interpreter. Those are a couple of my students. I kept my office hours religiously, and they took advantage of that. And I wondered, gosh, you know, I know I'm not speaking to them in Chinese, but a teacher can kind of develop a feeling of whether the students are getting the message or not. You can kind of tell by their facial expressions. And so I'd usually repeat what I said in a different way and try to reinforce it if I thought there was something they didn't understand. And I was under the clear impression that they were understanding it, but their questions were good and on point. And so I had some of them come into my office, and they'd ask me questions that I was sure they understood. Well, I soon learned they wanted to practice their English on a native speaker. And they had the opportunity to see some American sitcoms that had been carefully cleared by their process of censorship. So they'd heard English spoken that way, and then they'd speak to each other, but it was useful for them to just have a conversation with someone such as myself. Most of them have American names. Almost all the kids do, because they know it's tough for us, or English names, because they know it's tough for us to pronounce their names. And I recognize James in that picture. He's the guy standing, and I'm not sure I recognize who the guy is seated next to me, but they all went by English names. That's Victoria on the left and Leon on the right. They were a couple of my favorite students. They'd even come over to where I lived. That was taken over where the foreign faculty lived, and they'd engage me in conversations there. The guy seated at the table is named Ming. He's a good friend of Wong Lee. Remember Wong Lee's the guy that came up to me and said, "Bob Brown, you're from Montana, so am I?" Well, Ming was a high school classmate of his there in Tianjin, and Ming's done very well in the bicycle business. So he took me to this wonderful restaurant where the specialty was dumplings, and where George Bush, the elder, the first George Bush, had eaten dumplings when he was our first U.S. envoy to China. So that was kind of a fun experience. And Ming's English wasn't real good, but I think he pretended like it was worse than it actually was. And I said, "Now, Ming, you've been to the United States, right?" And he said, "Yeah, I'd been there 11 times. And I said, recently? And he said, yeah. In fact, he said, the most recent time I was in Las Vegas, America. He said, I lost $250,000 American. So some of them are very wealthy. That's the barracks building, the one with the point on the top, where young Mike Mansfield, as a young Marine enlisted man, was barracks back in the early 1920s. That's the mausoleum or the tomb of Mao Zedong. It's located in Tiananmen Square, which is the big central square in Beijing. And I was there on a day when people could walk by and view his body. So I saw him lying in state there. He looked like he was wonderfully well preserved, and there's some apparently question about whether it's actually him. But he looked pretty well preserved if it was. And that was an interesting experience too. As I mentioned, they just about have made him into a god. We've got George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Jackson, different American presidents on our currency. You see, he's just the only one on all their currency. I think it serves the leader's purpose to have a kind of a unifying national figure, regardless of whether he was ever a very effective national leader. That is Tiananmen Square. That's Mao's tomb in the background. Anybody recognize, does that look familiar in the foreground, that picture? What do we remember about Tiananmen Square? Yeah, remember the tank? Yeah. There was a young Chinese student that stood defiantly in front of a tank right in that exact spot. And that picture was published around the world. You can't ask about that. When I was there at Tiananmen Square, I tried to ask David, my young tour guide. He didn't want to talk about that. He was the guy that shadowed me incidentally all the time I was in China, and I'll tell you just a brief story about him when we get to his picture. But and I tried to, there was another tour guide that was from some English-speaking country, and I stopped her and asked her, where did that incident occur? Boy, she just didn't want to talk about that at all. So obviously that's something that the government there is trying to suppress even the memory of. Behind me, where that picture was taken, is the Forbidden City. And the Chinese are in the process now of rehabilitating the buildings where tourists would likely go when they come to visit the Olympic Games in 2008. And they're just indescribably magnificent old buildings. And they're using labor-intensive methods in order to restore them, and that'd be an example. That's another example. They're proud of the opportunity to have the Olympic Games, and it also affords them an opportunity to provide lots of jobs. That's at the Summer Palace, also near Beijing, where the emperors spent their summer months. That's a pagoda over in Xi'an, which is way across China from where Tianjin is located. It's a Buddhist temple, and there were Buddhist people there as well as many Muslims there. I should tell you, I got there by train. I flew back to Tianjin, but I took the train over there because I wanted to see as much of the countryside as I could, and I had a 4-day weekend. So we traveled over 20 hours on the train. And remember, Professor West told you this morning all the wheat is in northern and central China? I couldn't believe my eyes. I guess I've been to China twice before, but in the southern part. And it was more typical of what we think of as China. But I think I must have gone across the equivalent of at least 2 states of Kansas in terms of wheat. It was just never ending. Just mile after mile after mile after mile of endless wheat fields. Buddhist monk, I'm a kind of a person who looks for every opportunity to talk to interesting people, and I had a few opportunities to talk to them. They were always grouchy. He stood still and let me take his picture, but I never really had a chance to learn anything from any of those people. I think they've been terribly persecuted, and maybe they were suspicious, I don't know. Those are the terracotta soldiers that were unearthed near Xi'an, which is the old ancient capital over in central China that I took the long train trip to see. And many other marvelous sites in that Xi'an area, ancient part of the Chinese civilization. Those are lifelike figures. And they have different faces, so they're modeled after people. The white cap indicates that he's a Muslim. And you know, all the tension that's taking place between us and the Muslims in the world, you'd think that they would be unfriendly to someone who looked like me. But they were always friendly. They were very approachable, and I was able to talk to some of them. The women they don't like to be photographed, so she turned her face away, but I had several pretty good encounters with Muslims over in the Xi'an area, and they were very friendly. Okay, that's David. He's the graduate student that was with me almost all the time I was in China. And the quick story about him is, I asked Professor Han Professor Han was a member of the Communist Party. And he said, no, but the two deans you met are. And he said, if you want to make any progress in China, get promoted in any way, you've got to be a member of the Communist Party. And he said, I'm just uncomfortable with that. He said, I just don't want to do that. I'm going to be a teacher, and I don't care about that. But he said, there's someone you know real well who's been with you almost all the time you've been here who's a member of the Communist Party. And I said, you're kidding. And he said, no. He said, David's an up-and-coming member of the Communist Party. And David has great English-speaking skills, and he couldn't have been a better tour guide, but I'm not sure that's the only reason, that he was with me all the time I was there. There we are on the Great Wall. The Great Wall is just breathtaking in magnitude and scope. It runs something like 1,500 miles. Some of it is almost disappeared from existence, but some of it's pretty well maintained, and it's gigantic. It's gigantic, and it's also built along the spines of ridges. It's not built down on the flat countryside where it'd be easy to build. It's built in the most inaccessible places possible to make it hard for the invaders to come in from the north. So it was an incredible construction project, of course, all built by slave labor, and pretty much maintained by slave labor through the communist period. You can see the young girls there with the cell phones. And of course, just almost every place you go in China, there are cell phones. Even old folks have cell phones. When we took that train ride out to Xi'an, she was in our compartment on the train. And the only words I heard her say in English, it happened to be the day before Easter. We went out on Saturday before Easter Sunday, and she said, before we got off the train, she said, I am a Christian, which really surprised me. I don't know what to make of that, but that's what she wanted me to know, and she could say it so I could understand it. Bicycles. That's the primary means of transportation. Professor Han, who I mentioned is here with me now, is something over 40 years old, and he rides a bicycle. Never learned how to drive a car. Even their commerce is carried on by bicycle. But you see the young people in the process of becoming rich, and pretty flashy cars and briefcases, they're in China too. They're a part of what's going on. That's one of those little ultra-efficient, ultra-economical cherry automobiles that we understand will be marketed in the United States beginning in 2008. You can see both the Chinese characters and the English characters on the sign. That's a typical peasant's market where common people would buy their food and groceries. That's an upscale supermarket. Look at that. That's a way common people can be involved in capitalism. And it's big in China. It's big in China. Walmart, they're very proud of Walmart. They're very proud of the fact that their people make a tenth of what we make here, but it's a high income in China to manufacture good quality products that help poor people in the United States. And that's how they'll tell you about big box stores. They'll say, how come people in the United States, we understand in some cases, have a problem with big box stores? Those big box stores provide wonderful job opportunities for us, some of the poorest people in the world, and we in turn manufacture good quality products which are made available to some of the poorest people in the United States. How can you be against that? I heard that several times when I was over there. You can see Colonel Sanders in the background there. And of course, Ronald McDonald is every place on earth, I think. That says it all. He's got his bicycle parked outside of McDonald's. He's talking on his cell phone, sitting in Ronald McDonald's lap. Containers, probably bound for somewhere in the Western world. The two languages. Highway construction, little three-wheel trucks, tricycle trucks. The ever-present smog and the cranes and the building construction. The buildings in the foreground are supposedly something over 2,000 years old, and the ones in the background under the shroud of smog are still under construction. He was here in the 1980s as a professor, and the most wonderful old man. He's almost 90 years old now, but one of the people that brought to see me right when I got there was him because of his Montana connection. And he had been terribly tortured and persecuted during the Cultural Revolution. I've been told about that before I met him, and of course, none of that came up at all, but he was just Mr. Sunshine, just a delightful person. I wish I could have spoken to him in his own language. You see some books that the censors have approved. You can see Ronald Reagan's picture on the front of that one, and I think Albert Einstein behind him, and Abraham Lincoln, I think, is in the picture. The Da Vinci Code. Bill Clinton is probably the single most popular American in China, as near as I could tell. I didn't hear a bad word about him all the time I was over there, and some of them volunteered to me that they thought he was a wonderful American president. He landed in Xi'an when he visited China, which was the ancient China capital, and then went to Beijing from there. And he didn't really give offense to anybody in Beijing by doing that, but he made a big hit in Xi'an by doing that. Always thinking politically. I took lots of pictures of school kids, and they all wear uniforms. I only have time to show you the one, but children's faces, I think, are pretty similar almost anywhere in the world. The people who looked like that didn't speak any English, and they didn't have warmth in their eyes when I looked at them, because I think they were the people that probably remembered the tension in the Korean War and that sort of thing. The older people, especially the older men, most of them dressed in that traditional kind of a uniform that you think of as during the Maoist era. The one-child policy, evidence of that all over China. And they dote on their children. They're going to have some spoiled kids in China, I think. Grandmas and grandpas with children. Just real quick, I met those two old guys, and I had a conversation through David, and one of them had a son, and they were so smiley. They just radiated smiles, and they were interested in talking to an American, and so we had a great conversation. And they didn't have English names, and most of the younger people did, and they mentioned that. They didn't have English names. I said, well, I'm going to name you right now. So I named them Pat and Mike. And then we took a picture, and I thought they'd smile in the picture, but they looked like they're torturing you or something. I don't know. Anyway, that's not the picture I'd hoped to have, but they were wonderful old gentlemen. There's an example of kind of that older generation, and you kind of see that sort of stoic demeanor. And that's more typical of the kids. Her name is Helena, and she was a tour guide that worked with us for a while when we were in Xi'an. And I had her Google Helena to prove to her it was the capital of Montana. She was a real nice kid. The first noise I heard when I got there, when I woke up in the morning, was the scratchy quacking of a magpie. And they're survivors, because almost any living thing in China that's big enough to eat's been eaten by now. But I saw a few magpies still around, so I think they're going to be among the world's last survivors. Well, thank you. Any questions or comments or screams of anguish? I know it's after 1 o'clock.
Here's a question, Bob.
Yeah.
Can you comment on healthcare system, kind of what it's like?
I think it's almost non-existent. I shouldn't say that as far as government sponsorship is concerned, as far as a coherent government program is concerned. They've got physicians and they've got some health care. They've got a selections process that allows them to abort children that aren't males. So that's adding to their demographic problem. They've got more babies than girl babies, and that difference is expanding. But when they think about wanting to be taken care of in their old age, think a boy could probably do a better job of it than a girl, and they've only got one child. Certainly their healthcare system is not non-existent, but I saw some things there too that had just startled any of us. You'd see people that had obvious, grotesque problems with their teeth, and limping in a way that made you think that if they had any kind of proper medical attention, they could have it attended to. I don't know that it's greatly different than some other third world countries, but it certainly wouldn't be very good by our standards.
Other questions, comments? If not, oh, yes.
Speak up. The question, as I understood it, was how well they're able to feed themselves, and I thought pretty well. Phil West's experiences have been the same as mine there. Mine are far more limited than his. But the food when I was there was plentiful, and it was good, and it was inexpensive. Now, and of course their population has been pretty well held in check by the one-child policy, so my guess is they'll be okay that way. If they'd continued with the Mao Zedong idea of everybody having 5 children, I mean, they would possibly have been able to feed their people by now. I think that's an example of how the profit motive in capitalism really pays off. I mean, in terms of feeding the people. The maldistribution of the wealth that can sometimes result from capitalism when there's no social safety net can lead to other problems like civil wars and things like that. But by intelligently using the private enterprise concept, they managed to feed themselves very well. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. One reminder before we go, please be sure and fill out the evaluation sheets and leave them on the table, the registration table. I want to thank First Interstate very much for their support in bringing you this Economic Outlook Seminar. I want to thank you all for attending, and we'll see you next year.